Okay, so we have time for questions. It's going to take a minute for questions to come through the board. Thank you for a wonderful lecture, and I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about. So I'll start out by opening the floor to you all.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Sorry, I'm thinking about what we're talking about, Foucault and the prisons and the actual environment and stuff. And my own field of studies looking at healthcare architecture and who the person is when they enter the hospital and who they are when they leave. And I wonder if there's anything in what you're talking about that relates to the way that we're now thinking about our own responsibilities towards ourselves in our life. Healthcare is shifting from what do I take to how do I live.
Yes.
And, you know, I'm wondering, you know, where all of this fits in with that modern idea of our own lives.
Yeah, it's a good question, one I'm probably not in a position to properly answer. My instinct would be to say that what Foucault was concerned with, I think, was the ways in which institutions trained people into certain modes of behavior. It's a repeated kind of trope in his writing. And one of the possible responses to that interpretation of the prison or the healthcare system is and was for Foucault to reject it, to say, well, I'm not going to involve myself, particularly with psychiatry, for example, which gives you a definition of what mentally normal is, and then describes a series of ways in which you might not act that way. And then if you hit enough of those things in the checklist in the medical book, you then are sort of diagnosed with something. And that categorizes you as abnormal in Foucault's way. So one of the ways you can respond to that is by resisting the series of definitions. And there is a movement afoot now to reimagine those categories, say, in psychiatry. There's also the possibility of, as you say, taking responsibility back and saying, well, actually what I'm going to do is I'm not going to go attend any GP, any doctor. I'm going to avoid that. But what I will do is take the responsibility onto myself and seek out a kind of autonomy. And part of, for example, the homeopathic approach is to be counterintuitive about this and to say, right, well, rather than saying, if I take this, it will repress my symptoms, and that's a good thing. What I actually need to do is to bring them out so that they come to a crisis and that solves them. So it's a kind of counterintuitive move. And it's a resistance, a broad resistance to the idea that's embedded in psychiatry right from the start, that repression can be a way forward and a problem. So how you handle that relationship, right back to Freud, about repressing certain desires, controlling them, managing them. There's an idea that Freud is really all about destroying the repressive urge. It's not. It's about training the repressive urge and about saying these are good urges, these are bad urges, put those ones away, manage these ones this way, and so on and so forth, and train the body and the mind to act in certain ways. Homeopathy runs counter to that. It's interested in destroying the possibility of repression and pushing it to allowing all of that out. And that, in a sense, is one way to respond, I hope, to the question, which is a really good one. But I think there is a tension in the idea. The other thing, of course, is there's simply just, the social cost is so big that the idea that once you define normality in a certain way, you can end up in a situation in which you've imprisoned a vast bulk of your population. So the American condition now is that it's being described as, a famous book about the new Jim Crow, putting racial minorities into prison because you don't match with normal behavior. So you stop people that are acting abnormally. Well, that depends on a particular definition, which is often racially defined, of normal. So all of that is what that then produces a huge social cost, which then people then say, well, hang on a minute, if we're actually going to have to pay for all of this, we might have to rethink. So I hope that helped.
Yeah.
So I have a question from the board,
Okay.
which I'm just going to read out and hope that I don't mangle. Can the romantic notion of an individual's authentic persona vary by occupation in Rousseauian philosophy? And the example given here is with relation to ideas of the author or artist as genius or the artistic temperament, and how that is sometimes actually appropriated, as mitigation for behavior that would not otherwise be tolerated, or that wouldn't be tolerated by people in other occupations. If that.
Yes. The specifics about where Rousseau would sit is interesting, because Rousseau's position is informed by a kind of classical republicanism as well, which I didn't get into here. But there is a idea around Rousseau that citizenship is a kind of moral duty, and engagement with the society is a moral duty. And that's what troubles him, right? So that at the heart of this is a kind of Genevan citizen who thinks that they should be involved, and how they get involved and articulate their voice freely is a problem. The romantic position is less that your duties are different in different places than they are, which is a kind of classical notion that goes back to a kind of civic or a kind of classical ideal of the virtues as different in different contexts. The idea for the romantics is that you are they're less interested in virtue than they are in freedom, if you like. And so what they're looking for is a sense of selfhood being expressed. And so the creative madness that your questioner refers to is absolutely vital, because it shows their willingness, if you will, to break with social convention in order to self-express. So this goes back to an argument I had with a teacher long, long ago in my secondary school about Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, where the line goes, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed, exclamation mark. And is this exclamation mark him going, ouch, this is really sore, or is this a celebration of experience? I thought it was a celebration of my experience. My teacher thought otherwise. The point about this is that what you're trying to get to with Romanticism is a celebration of broad experience, so you break down all those social duties and you destroy them in the search for your authentic self. So Napoleon becomes a romantic hero in the work of Carlyle, because he looks at the map of Europe and goes, you know, I don't mind the map of Europe, but France should just be like bigger. And he imposes his will on it to produce a bigger France. And that capacity to change, to warp reality to your will and to your sense of selfhood is a romantic ideal. The classical idea is that your courage expresses itself as a virtue, not in your capacity to destroy duties, but to fulfill duties. You're a courageous fireman because you run into a burning building. You're a courageous writer because you write things that you think are true, even though you think you're going to end up in prison for saying it. It's a different form of courage. Intellectual courage and physical courage are different, but the virtue is to be expressed. You wouldn't expect intellectual courage from a fireman, nor would you necessarily expect a writer to run into a burning building. But the role is different. I hope that helps. There is a difference between, in a sense, a classical set of virtue ethics and an ethics of romanticism, which is about self-expression and freedom.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have 3 questions. I don't know whether I will take them now. Now, the first is Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish.
Yes.
I'd seen that work. I don't know how much I still remember about it. But I'm looking at the fact that it seems to me that he connects, the evolution of punishment from the corporal to the soul, where it becomes a rehabilitation, to the 19th century and the onset of capitalism. Is there a connect between the two? This, transition in the form of, in the nature of punishment from the corporate to, where the emphasis now is in the soul and the rehabilitation of the human person. Does it have any connect with capitalism?
Okay, right. Do you want to answer your second question?
Okay, then the second question is about the idea of appearance and reality. So is that we see that even from Rousseau down to Derrida and Paul de Man, and the linguistic tone, the whole point is that there's a difference between appearance and reality. Now, my question is, does it also link back to Karl Marx's misinterpretation of history, such that he believes that we move from communalism to capitalism and then communism, and the fact that is not realized, that kind of prediction of history from the interpretation of reality, does that kind of disconnect between appearance and reality?
Okay.
Link back to that kind of thing. Then the last is this linguistic tone.
Yeah.
I've seen something of Derrida. In fact, my second degree project was, has connected very strongly with Derrida. But I've not seen much of a Paul de Man. Can you please distinguish between the two of them? Sorry.
No. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Not at all. I'll try and answer those in turn, if I may. Discipline and punish. You're right. He thinks that the early 19th century is the kind of key moment of turn. He dates back the philosophical ideas to Beccaria in the 1750s, and then ultimately in Bentham. And Howard is kind of in between and is segued out, because Foucault is not the best of empirical historians, to be fair. That's not his ambition. But there's a discourse that he's interested in, which, as you nicely put it, turns from corporeal punishment to management of the soul. What I think he's interested in, the reason why I think there is perhaps a relationship to capitalism, but only by kind of paralleling, although Foucault is very good at drawing allegories. Right? So this is like this, is like this, is like this, and eventually everything becomes everything else. Foucault's position is that, in a sense, that the prison or the clinic is like a factory. Now, he never really explores this, but the point is that what you produce is work discipline. And he's interested, in a sense, in the production of institutions that demand certain kinds of behavior from a human being. Right? So it comes back to this question of how you put people into a factory and expect them to do certain kinds of work from 9 to 5. You're going to stand there, and as a friend of mine once did, check that the toothpaste tube tops are on properly for 8 hours. Right? And that's all you're going to do, and it's going to be banal and boring and tedious. But if you don't do it, the system breaks down. So good behavior in this model of the institution is one in which you fulfill a kind of expectation of control, and the manager of the institution is supposed to ensure that all the people in the institution behave in a certain kind of way. So there's a paralleling, if you like, between being stuck in a prison and being stuck in a workforce. And that, I think, is where he sees this turn into capitalism having some kind of purchase. And this is a kind of radical critique of that kind of approach. I hope that's helpful. The other one about ideas and the relationship between appearances and reality. It's a little bit more complex than perhaps just simply inserting Marx into the argument, because what you get in Marx's misinterpretation of reality is, as I alluded to at the start, a kind of constant anxiety, frankly, about why the revolution hasn't shown up yet. He keeps waiting for the revolution to happen. He sits around. When he hears that 1848, he thinks it's all going to happen in Germany. 1848, a revolution breaks out in Paris. He thinks that's not supposed to happen. He gets on a train and goes to Paris. He thinks it's going to happen in London, so he moves to London and sits around in the British Museum writing Das Kapital. It's a kind of study in intellectual failure in a funny way. And it's a little, so there's a problem about that, which is that Marx's history is progressive, but the progress hasn't happened yet. Where I think there is a difference, there is a concern with the relationship between appearance and reality. It's not about the kind of historicity, the misinterpretation of reality. It's not that the revolution hasn't happened yet. But he's interested in what he terms false consciousness. The idea that people can misunderstand their own interests because power has told them to think certain ways. Right? So to pick an example that I find occasionally in writings in my own work, my own sort of field of interest, the kind of nationalist and unionist positions in Northern Ireland are sometimes can be articulated as, the problem is you guys just don't understand. right? Talking across the bridge to the other side can become, to say, for example, to the Unionists, the nationalist line will be, if only you really recognized how Irish you are, we wouldn't have this problem. You suffer from a false consciousness that means that you think of yourself as British because you've been inculcated in British-minded schools and a British educational system, etc., etc. And Marx is interested in how people can suffer from this, what he terms false consciousness, and fall on the wrong side of history. So the appearance is that they are interested in certain kinds of economic interest, right? So they're on the side of the employers, although their actual material reality should dictate that they're on the side of the employee. So the reality of their situation and their own understanding of the situation has bifurcated. So that's where Marx kind of integrates into this. He gives you an exposition of why things haven't happened yet and where some of the obstacles are to this transparency between the linkage between reality and appearance. One of the obstacles is false consciousness that Starobinsky is interested in. Paul de Man and Derrida, you know, I was looking at this earlier today and thinking, you know, if somebody asks that the kind of precise, I'm gonna pass. Derrida, I mean, it's difficult to sort of pull these guys apart, in part because they're so concerned with being elusive, frankly. Both of them are concerned with a kind of death of author, and the authorial voice becomes very ethereal in the midst of it all. And so they can be difficult to break apart, and I'm not the one to ask. There are people who really know lots more about deconstruction than I do. So I'm told it's next week. So if you want to know the answer to that question, ask next time.
Thank you very much.
I'll just ask.
So I have several questions from the board.
Okay.
One from the question I think is really interesting. Apart from illiterate wives and the execution of Marie Antoinette, where are women in these histories of history?
Okay.
We also have a couple of questions about contemporary politics.
Sure.
So one is, how would you interpret the current U.S. presidential electioneering through Enlightenment thinking? Which ideas resonate most in this context? Possibly a can of worms.
No,
never. And the other one is asking about the post-9/11 era, which you've already spoken to a little bit. How has the extent of attempts by authorities to regulate behavior changed over time and place? And where does the present so-called post-9/11 era sit in this? Is the war on terror, in quotation marks, and the associated legislation ostensibly imposed for national security, which restricts what can be said without arrest or referral to anti-radicalization programs, again, often racially and culturally biased. So where does the present so-called post-9/11 era sit in this? And sorry, I'm sort of not parsing this correctly, but
so I get the theme. I get the theme.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, in order. One of the issues around the role of women in the emergence of what I've been describing as the history of histories is that, I mean, factually, it's not really until the 1960s that much of it takes hold. There's a period in the 1790s, interestingly, when women are extensively engaged in public discourse, and you get Wollstonecraft, you get Mary Barber, you get a whole array of writers, particularly in England, who are concerned with public issues. In the French Revolution itself, there's a society set up for to promulgate the rights of women, which promptly gets disbanded rather violently by the Jacobins. A friend of mine who wrote a history of French feminism tried to write, he described it on one occasion as trying to write a narrative in which Rousseau is not at fault for putting women into the domestic sphere. And he spent years researching it and came to the conclusion that Rousseau was at fault. He had put women in the domestic sphere, and that was the outcome. So there is a problem about that. There's also a problem about the ways in which women have entered the profession. So that, in a sense, we're only really starting to get women both focused as subjects and as authors in the last 50 or so years, really since the 1960s. And in that regard, so work by Dina Goodman, for example, which I referred to here, is absolutely fundamental to our rethinking of this story. One of the things that has been difficult about it is that they, rightly I think, have been often loath to go near Rousseau because he's such a misogynistic human being. So a kind of female read on Rousseau has been difficult to get hold of beyond a sort of sense of condemnation. Goodman, I think, is particularly good on this, about saying working out the ways in which his antagonism to women was part of a wider brief on the part of Rousseau, and fed into this idea that women were dictating terms to him and that they had social appearance concerns. There was issues around fashion. Fashion becomes a key issue in the 18th century, and it's partly because it's an area in which women are seen to have control. So we're getting there. We're not there yet, but we are getting there with this story. And there has been some broader contributions that we could allude to on the history of consumerism, on radical thought, a whole array of other topics in which women have made large-scale contributions to our understanding. Rousseau, in a sense, has been one of the, a kind of blind spot. The USA, how do I begin? One of the things to know is, I mean, it's a fairly trite thing to say, but in fact, watching the US election is a little bit like watching an 18th century electorate in action. Precisely because what's involved is moving from state to state to state, so small-scale communities, standing out on the stump, talking face-to-face in these town halls, trying to argue your case, and moving around from the different places and spaces. And the whole organization of it depends on an 18th century revolution. So the idea that, Michigan has a certain amount of delegates that it can send is the consequence of a brokerage deal that's been struck really in the 18th century. So the relationship between federal rights or state rights and state rights is an 18th century problematic. And indeed, it's one answer to the question that Rousseau poses about how you create a big republic. So in its very simple terms, the US election is an Enlightenment event in that sense. And it has all of the issues that play out at that point, where one of the nice pieces that's been said about it is it does at least mean that people like Barack Obama have to actually go to small towns in the Midwest and make their case. They are not in a position where they just sit in the Capitol and dictate. And you don't get that kind of every 4 years somebody has to go out and go all across the US to make their case. So there's that side to it. So yeah, beyond that, I don't want to go too far. I mean, it's the other. What you then will see is, of course, the emergence of political parties, which is much more of a 19th century event, and that, in a sense, is one of the distorting qualities of that process of Enlightenment electioneering. But at the heart of it is a sense of the democratic voice of small communities in action, and that in a sense is an Enlightenment moment. Authorities, regulation of behaviour, national security. Nice I'm getting all the small topics tonight. Where do we go? One of the issues I think that is at stake at the moment is the ways in which, for example, there's still those issues around demarcation of, to use the 1980s term, of the other. And the politics of fear and anxiety play into this. So where people are deemed to be outside the normal expected social, ethnic, religious backgrounding, distrust can be built. And part of the issue around national security as well, and this is where I think there is a kind of boundary line, is that there is a tendency to think about well, let's use the term radicalization to talk about this. Radicalization and radical activity are in some ways two different things. And one of the difficulties that the governments are rightly, I think, having is working out when one leads to the other, when thought leads to action. And how you legislate for that has been a problem for governments in perpetuity. And where do you draw the line between freedom of thought and and regulated thought? Because in fact, all societies have had censorship of some kind or another. And where that line is one that's in constant and perpetual debate. And whether that line is drawn accurately, effectively, is for the society as a whole to ultimately judge, I guess. But yeah, it's that idea of the regulation of behavior is one that does have an interest in that relationship between ideas and action. And there is a sense that political normality ideas about political normality are sometimes being deployed, which don't necessarily have the same purchase if you move around the globe. One of the difficulties has been a kind of what Edmund Burke described as a kind of geographic morality, that things are different in other bits of the world, and whether that relates to whether there's been a tendency for intellectuals to argue the case for that. And you can see that in our broader politics of the politics of identity. So that things are culturally significant for particular communities has gained, the idea that is important has gained a kind of political traction. And so one of the things that we are working with is a culture in which universal norms are in tension with norms amongst communities and local norms. And how that then gets regulated is in fact the essence of politics in some ways at the moment. What we're really debating is where we draw those boundary lines. And the Enlightenment helpfully provides advice on both sides. As you'll find quite frequently when you study intellectual movements, you can find advocates for both sides of the argument. So there's no simple guide.
Other questions from the room? Would Socrates have been arrested in 21st century Britain?
Would he have been arrested in 20th century Britain? Which bit of the 20th century?
21st century.
21st century, sorry. Well, I think there's always been an anxiety about the corruption of youth. But his ideas are now just part of the norm in Western civilization. So, and we do provide, I mean, one of the wonders of universities is they are still spaces in which intellectual debate can, broadly speaking, happen. And they are, in that sense, as kind of protected zones. They're socially recognized spaces for intellectual experiment. So you'd like to think he'd have a university position, but I wouldn't bet on it. He might not have written enough for the ref.
So I guess I would like to ask if you could say a little bit more maybe about what we're actually studying when we're studying history.
Okay.
So we're doing a history of histories here. It's fairly meta, and maybe it should always be a little more meta than we tend to take it. But can you say a little bit about kind of the methods that you employ in your own research, the way that you think about kind of shaping historical narratives, and the way that you see your own work in the context, very broadly, kind of the various fields of knowledge production?
It's easier to do it to other people than it is to do it to yourself, to describe in this way. I think one of the things that you need to be cognizant of, and this isn't an answer, it's more of a question that you pitch back at people, is to say, well, look, how in a sense is the work that I do, or you do, and that kind of, say, the PhD topic even that you've taken on, how does that relate to and is how is it inflected by and informed by current debates and concerns? That's not to say it's a simple pragmatic thing of saying, oh, where do I find impact? I write this because I'm going to do this, I'm going to talk to this audience, and therefore they'll listen because it's on message in some way. Rather, what I'm thinking about is the ways in which the choices that you make and the themes that you, in choosing themes, in choosing structure, in choosing right down to the kind of vocabulary that you're deploying, is informed by broader debates and concerns. So to take an example, I am pretty sure that without really thinking about it too hard, that the work that I did on John Toland, who was an 18th century early free thinker, and a radical critic of revealed religion, of the Bible, of clerics in particular. I'm pretty sure that the reason I thought about him as a conspiracy theorist is because conspiracy theory was doing the rounds. And it's there. He talks about how the clerics had sort of taken knowledge in, had removed it from lay understanding, had maintained a kind of position of power over society by claiming a level of knowledge that others don't have, revealed access to divine truth. So he designs religion as a kind of grand conspiracy against the lay people. So it's in the writing, and it's not untrue to say it, but I think the fact that I picked that aspect of his writing up was probably informed by a lot of what I was reading elsewhere and thinking about. Some of the ways in which you can then deploy even the choices that you make about what your themes are and how you're going to organize your material is often informed by the kinds of interest that you find elsewhere. I read a lot about civil society, which is one of the things I was mentioning here, at a point at which I was also writing my PhD. So my PhD became a kind of weird study in friendship. And it was about issues of how people get along when they don't share religious position, when they don't share a position of power in the society, how politicians make friends with people who aren't politicians, all of that kind of stuff, the relationship between the broad civil society and the politics of a country were in that writing. But that's to sort of self-reflect and theorize. But I think it's important that in that sense you do understand that what you're doing is writing at a particular moment in time, and that what you're doing is intervening in a public debate which itself is shaping what you're doing. And the stuff that you're reading is also informed by it. So the more you become aware of how this historiography develops, the more articulate you can become about what you're doing yourself. And I proved rightly now that I'm not that articulate about what I'm doing, but I'll leave it at that.
I mean, I think this speaks to an anxiety that a lot of us have as scholars, which is that we're either behind the curve on something, or that we're, and jumping on a bandwagon. Neoliberalism, let's do it. Everyone talk about neoliberalism, or whatever it is. And the ways in which we need to, well, and just are attuned to the conversations that other scholars are having in our own discipline and outside it, and public debate, and all of these things.
Yeah. I mean, I think really the anxiety is one of relevance, in a way. Is what I'm doing, PhD work is hard enough, frankly. You sit in a library, if you're anything like me, for long hours. You become socially awkward. You develop all kinds of habits of working late into the night and at antisocial hours. And when you do finally go to the pub, all you're talking about is 18th century politics, and really no one wants to know anymore. So all of that kind of unhinges you from a kind of social context that gives you a sense of purchase and immediacy. So it's difficult. And in that regard, I think that understanding your position vis-a-vis, the newspapers, the literature that you're reading, and the work that you're doing historically or in literary terms or whatever it may be, all of that will help to keep a sort of sense of sanity on the project and a sense of relevance to it. And it doesn't just become a kind of antiquarian, 18th century exposition of, well, I've discovered a letter which, you know, shows John Toland's laundry list in 1712, that sort of thing. Actually, what you're trying to do is drive towards a contribution which you can then bring back into a public debate, be it at a conference or and amongst scholarly peers. And I think that's what you're trying to do is, with all the writing, is to make a contribution to the conversation.
Yeah.
No more than that. So yeah, it's always difficult, but that's where I find the historiography side helpful. Is it helps me ground myself in what the current debate is and why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Do you have another question from the room? I have another one that slightly turns us from. It's sort of related, but not directly from the board.
Sure.
And it's with respect to universities as protected from censorship, so as to have serious debate. And I think that's something that we hold dear, the idea that as academics we should have freedom of speech.
Yeah.
Could it be argued that the whole of the public sphere should be able to benefit from this protection, and that a society in which proper debate has retreated to the exclusive purview of the ivory towers is in fact a broken one?
It can be argued, but I'm not sure it's ever occurred. There is a nice idea which you'll find expressed in people like in writings by someone like Jürgen Habermas. Effectively, the idea of a critical public sphere is that the idea will be kind of tested and honed out and reshaped through the process of public debate. That by putting something into the public domain, you test it. And in many ways, that's, in a sense, what we have as our ideal type when we do academic writing, right? I sit down, I write an article, and what's the first thing that happens to it when I send it to a journal? They say, all right, we're going to send it to 2 other people who'll tell you how rubbish it is, right? And the peer review process is predicated on this kind of neat idea that somehow ideas will get tested in the fire of public debate.
Yeah.
The problem with that, amongst other things, is that it pretends that there's something like an adult conversation going on. And to be fair, anybody who's been involved in an adult conversation wants to avoid these things like the plague anyway. When you're told you're in an adult conversation, you've got to behave properly, you're really in trouble. But what's really going on is that there's a kind of play of prejudice as well in hand. And one of the things that I've been interested in a very different line of work that I'm doing, is in what I've described in various places as the rude enlightenment or the impolite public sphere. And the ways in which personal abuse become or are deployed in intellectual debate. So there's this very to just synopsize very quickly. One of the things that we pretend is that somehow that if I sit here and say, well, I know this because I've read all this stuff, but you've read more than me, you win. Right? You know more than me, therefore they win. You win. In fact, what's happening is that the person who says, I've read more than you, ergo I'm better, is in fact dismissing you and is being quite rude, frankly, and patronizing and saying, but I've read more, look at my footnotes, they're bigger, they're longer, and so on and so on. So the whole of this idea of Enlightenment debate is in fact, as a kind of test of knowledge, is partly dependent on an idea that somehow established authority should hold ground. So it actually dismisses the possibility of innovation, and it reduces the capacity for critical and fresh thinking, which we can see repeatedly in academic work that regularly gets peer reviewed because it aligns with what's expected. Right? And so the breakthrough moments are often things that are not the consequence of what we'd like to think of as tried and tested, peer-reviewed articles, honed debate, etc., etc., etc. And the other thing that goes on is, quite frankly, that people just get rude with each other. And most public debate, as we can see, to turn back to the American elections, for example, often does descend, public debate often does descend into a he said, she said shouting match. And the nature of political discussion is often nothing to do with whether the health service should be run better by putting in more tax or whether it should be privatized. Those are ideological positions that you're not going to shift by any level of empirical evidence. So would it be nice? Yeah, maybe, but it's not going to happen because of the way human beings are built and the way in which debate happens. Public debate is, and the kind of, in fact, what you've got in academic life is a kind of reification of an idea of what debate ought to look like, and actually fails quite often to recognize what's actually happening, even in academic debate itself.
Yeah, this ties into an earlier question about the place of women, that we know study after study shows us that peer review and that promotion practices tend to be gendered.
Yeah.
And yet we act as though they are perfectly rational processes that, are not ideological. Yeah, that's interesting. I like shifting it from the rational enlightenment to the rude enlightenment.
This has been Theories of Knowledge. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. We'll be broadcasting from the University of Stirling, where Dr. Andrew Haas will speak about post-structuralism and the linguistic turn. Goodbye.